The courtroom was waiting to break him. He walked in ready. The federal courthouse in downtown Miami buzzed with anticipation that humid Tuesday morning. Laptops balanced on knees, notepads out, journalists jostled for position in the gallery. Every seat was taken, and all eyes were on one name, George Soros. The hearing had drawn national attention. Not only was it a high-profile corruption case, but standing as lead counsel for the defense was Soros himself. And opposing him from the bench? The notoriously ruthless Judge John Roberts. At precisely 9 a.m., Roberts entered the courtroom. His black robes billowed behind him like a storm. At 68, he carried himself like a man who believed he was the law. Wire-rimmed glasses, rigid posture, cold eyes. He was the very image of judicial power. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room fell silent. Soros stood calmly, impeccably dressed in a dark, understated suit. His silver hair was neatly combed, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward as Judge Roberts scanned the courtroom with detached authority. "Mr. Soros," Roberts said without even looking up from the bench, "I see you're representing the defense today. That surprises me. A case this complex, given your record." He said it like a challenge, like a taunt. Soros didn't flinch. "Good morning, Your Honor. Yes, I am lead counsel for the defense." Roberts shuffled through some papers. "Let's hope you're better prepared than your last time in my courtroom. We wouldn't want another embarrassment." A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. Everyone remembered Soros's last appearance before Roberts, how the judge had interrupted him constantly, denied motion after motion, and humiliated him in front of a packed house. But what no one knew was that Soros had spent the last 6 months preparing for this very moment. "I assure you, Your Honor," Soros replied calmly, "I'm fully prepared." His voice was steady, his tone respectful, but behind it, something stirred. Those who knew him recognized the faintest edge in his voice. George Soros didn't forget. For the next 40 minutes, Judge Roberts hammered him. He questioned every argument, cut off every explanation, granted the prosecution endless freedom while clamping down on Soros's defense with surgical precision. Every time Soros began to build momentum, Roberts interrupted, ruling against motions, dismissing statements, talking over him. And yet Soros never lost control. He stayed calm, focused, collected. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. Even some of the reporters began to exchange uneasy looks. It wasn't just harsh. It was personal. Meanwhile, Soros was quietly jotting notes on his yellow legal pad. Not frantic scribbles, but precise, deliberate documentation. He was building something. At 12:10 p.m., Judge Roberts peered over his glasses. "We'll recess for lunch. Mr. Soros, I suggest you use this time to reconsider your strategy. At this rate, your client may want to explore a plea deal." The prosecution team smirked. One even chuckled under his breath. But Soros simply gathered his papers with slow, intentional movements. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, voice firm and calm. "I look forward to continuing after recess." As Judge Roberts left the bench, he didn't see what the gallery couldn't ignore. A thick manila folder, federal markings clearly visible, had just been slid onto the defense table by Soros's co-counsel. It hadn't been there before. And in the last row, a tall woman had entered unnoticed, her DOJ credentials hanging from her neck. The storm was gathering, but Judge Roberts, blind in his arrogance, couldn't see the clouds. He thought it was a game. She brought evidence. When court reconvened after lunch, the atmosphere had shifted. The air in the courtroom was thick, tense. Word had spread during the break. The morning's tension, the judge's hostility, Soros's unshakable calm. Now, the gallery was more crowded than ever. Reporters had returned with backup. There was a buzz in the air, like people sensed something big was coming. Judge John Roberts returned to the bench with the same imperial presence. But there was something theatrical now, exaggerated, almost smug. "Mr. Soros," he began, no pleasantries. "I reviewed some of your filings over the break. I must say I'm struggling to follow your legal reasoning. Perhaps you could enlighten us with your unique interpretation of precedent." Laughter rippled from the prosecution table. One attorney leaned over and whispered something that made her colleague stifle a laugh. George Soros adjusted his jacket and stood. "I'd be happy to clarify, Your Honor. The precedent set in Harrison v. Miller." "Harrison versus Miller?" Roberts interrupted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Really, Mr. Soros? That case was gutted by the 11th Circuit just last year. I would have expected someone with your credentials to stay current on jurisprudence." But he was wrong. The case Roberts referenced had been Harris versus Millbrook, a completely different ruling. The error was glaring, obvious to every competent lawyer in the room. Still, before Soros could respond, Roberts rolled on. "Perhaps in New York the standards for legal arguments are more flexible," he said, sneering, "but in my courtroom, I expect more than charm and political donations." That crossed a line. Even the prosecution team went quiet. Reporters were typing furiously, and in the jury box, expressions ranged from confused to openly uncomfortable. Soros didn't flinch. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to the supplemental brief filed last week. Page 17 outlines the distinction between Harrison v. Miller and the case I believe you are referencing." Judge Roberts waved a hand dismissively. "I've been on the bench for 25 years, Mr. Soros. I don't need a refresher course from someone whose legal career has mostly taken place in front of cameras." Silence, then more typing. A court sketch artist captured the moment. Judge Roberts leaning forward with disdain, and Soros standing calm and composed. Behind Soros, his co-counsel continued quietly laying out documents, calm, methodical, precise. They weren't just building a defense, they were building a record. "Your Honor," Soros said after another snide comment, "I request that my objection to the court's characterization be entered into the record." "Note whatever you like," Roberts snapped. "It won't change the weakness of your case." Soros said nothing. He simply nodded. In the moments that followed, Roberts called both legal teams to a sidebar. He leaned in close, voice low, but still loud enough to be heard by anyone nearby. "You're out of your depth, Mr. Soros. You always have been. Your reputation won't save you in my courtroom." Soros didn't react, but as they returned to their tables, his co-counsel quietly slid another document across the table. He looked down at it, then closed the folder. Just a nod, almost imperceptible, but something had shifted. In the gallery, the Department of Justice observer was now joined by 3 more individuals, each wearing the unmistakable earpieces of federal agents. They didn't speak, they didn't move, but their presence was loud. Still, Judge Roberts continued, unaware of the fire building beneath his feet. And Soros? He was no longer defending a client, he was preparing to put the court itself on trial. The Islam and everything turned. 3 hours into the afternoon session, Judge Roberts' insults had become routine. Each time Soros began a thought, Roberts interrupted. Each time he laid a foundation, the judge knocked it down. The pattern had become so predictable, it sucked the life out of the room. The courtroom was tired. Reporters, once energized, now typed slower. The jury shifted in their seats, visibly uneasy. Until Soros stood up. His voice, calm and measured all day, now carried something new. Clarity and quiet force. "Your Honor," he began, "before we proceed with the defense's opening arguments, I'd like to address several procedural matters that have arisen during today's session." Judge Roberts sighed audibly, theatrically. "Mr. Soros, we've already wasted enough time on procedural complaints, unless you finally have something substantive." "There is, Your Honor," Soros said, and interrupted him for the first time. The room froze. That simple interruption, measured and unapologetic, sent a ripple of energy through the room. People leaned in. Something was changing. "I'd like to direct the court's attention to Judicial Canon 2A, Soros continued, which states that a judge shall respect and comply with the law and shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary." Roberts' face darkened. "Are you suggesting this court has failed to uphold judicial standards, Counselor?" "I'm not suggesting it," Soros replied, locking eyes with the bench. "I'm formally entering into the record-documented evidence of misconduct relevant to these proceedings." A silence louder than any voice fell over the room. The prosecution table stiffened. Their heads turned. This wasn't in their script. "And what exactly does this documentation reveal?" Roberts demanded. Soros turned to the side. Agent Rivera, a man in a dark suit, stepped forward from the gallery, carrying a document in a leather case. We have documented 7 private meetings between Your Honor and Mr. Maxwell Harrington, CEO of Gulfstream Industries, the primary party that would benefit financially from a conviction in this case. A collective intake of breath swept the gallery. Soros moved to the evidence cart, withdrawing a thick binder. Your Honor, I'm entering into evidence transcripts of conversations between you and Mr. Harrington, in which you discussed, and I quote, ensuring the right outcome in this trial. He placed a copy before the judge, handed others to the clerk and opposing counsel. Judge Roberts' skin drained of color. Soros continued, now in complete control of the room. In addition, we have records of offshore deposits made into an account linked to Your Honor, each deposit made within 48 hours of rulings favorable to Gulfstream Industries or its subsidiaries. Gasps, audible gasps. The lead prosecutor shot up from his seat. Your Honor, the government had no knowledge of these allegations. We request an immediate sidebar with Department of Justice representatives. Judge Roberts looked frozen. He stared at the documents in front of him. Bank statements, wire transfers, shell company connections. All roads pointed to his chambers. From the back of the courtroom, 4 federal agents now stood along the wall, their faces unreadable, their posture unmistakably alert. But Soros wasn't finished. We also have evidence that Your Honor suppressed exculpatory evidence in 3 separate cases, resulting in wrongful convictions, each of which directly benefited Gulfstream Industries. Soros's co-counsel activated the courtroom display. Emails lit up on the screen. Real emails. Between Roberts and corporate lawyers. Between Roberts and political donors. Between Roberts and prosecution witnesses. This correspondence was obtained legally through federal insurance, Soros explained, as part of an ongoing corruption investigation. The jury was no longer silent. One older woman shook her head slowly. Her face said it all, disgust and betrayal. Roberts' voice came back, but it was hoarse. This is outrageous. These documents are verified, cross-referenced, and authenticated, Soros said, not allowing him to finish. And there's more. He nodded to Agent Rivera, who stepped forward with a sealed envelope. This is a formal request from the Department of Justice, Soros said, for an emergency suspension of these proceedings pending investigation into judicial misconduct. The clerk handed the envelope to Roberts, whose hands now visibly trembled. The room was silent again, but this time it was different. Not out of respect, out of shock. The judge tried to regain control. It was too late. Judge John Roberts fumbled with the Department of Justice envelope. His fingers were clumsy, his movements slow. He tore it open like a man, hoping he was reading the wrong story. The courtroom remained frozen. No one moved. The press didn't blink. The jury sat still, jaws tight. The only sound was the soft clatter of the court reporter's stenotype machine, recording every second. Roberts' face shifted from pale to a blotchy crimson. It crept up his neck, reached his ears, then settled in a sweaty flush under the courtroom lights. This, he stammered, this is procedurally irregular. These accusations should have been filed through proper channels, not dropped in open court as some kind of publicity stunt. George Soros remained standing, unmoved. Your Honor, we attempted to file through the proper channels 3 times over the past 4 months. Each time, the filings disappeared from the docket. After the 3rd attempt, we had no choice but to present the evidence in open court, where it could be properly documented. He gestured toward the court reporter, who nodded subtly and kept typing. For the record, Soros added, copies of those 3 previous filings, along with time-stamped delivery confirmations, are included in Evidence Package B. From the prosecution table, lead attorney James Moretti, a seasoned litigator, stood, face grave. Your Honor, in light of these developments, we request a recess to confer with DOJ representatives. Judge Roberts looked over their heads, at the gallery, at the 4 silent federal agents, at the court clerk, who now looked visibly shaken. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Soros's voice broke the silence again. Your Honor, I'd also like to submit a chronological record of today's proceedings, annotated with judicial canons we believe were violated. His co-counsel approached the bench, placing a thick binder before the judge. Now the gallery sat straighter. Reporters leaned forward. The entire courtroom felt like it was inching toward the edge of a cliff. I'd also like to draw the court's attention, Soros continued, to rulings Your Honor has issued in similar cases. Rulings where attorneys made the exact same arguments we made today and were not interrupted, mocked, or denied basic motions. He began citing case numbers, dates, quotes from Roberts' own past rulings. The pattern was unmistakable. It wasn't just judicial strictness, it was bias. Deliberate, targeted bias. Roberts' face shifted again. He looked small. Mr. Soros, he said, straining to reassert control, this court will not entertain unfounded accusations. These accusations are not unfounded, Your Honor, Soros said, sliding another document to the clerk. This is a formal motion for your recusal under 28 U.S. Code Bushfires 455. A judge must disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. From the back row, the DOJ observer moved closer, now standing with an unobstructed view of the bench. Jurors were openly staring at Roberts. One of them, a middle-aged woman, folded her arms tightly across her chest. Soros kept going. We also have reason to believe Your Honor's impartiality in this case has been compromised by undisclosed communications with parties holding financial interests in the verdict. His associate distributed sealed envelopes to the clerk, the prosecution, and Roberts' own judicial assistant. For transparency, Soros said, and for the first time all day, Roberts looked rattled. He reached for his water glass. His hand trembled. This is highly irregular, Mr. Soros, he murmured, though his voice had lost all of its bite. Soros didn't raise his voice. Indeed it is, Your Honor. Almost as irregular as a federal judge meeting privately with witnesses scheduled to testify for the prosecution. The gasp that followed was audible. The prosecutor turned, confused. Your Honor, we have no knowledge of any such meetings. The court reporter's fingers hovered, then resumed typing at full speed. The only sound left in the room was the soft tapping of the keys and the growing dread in the space between them. Judge Roberts looked toward the exit, then back at Soros. For the first time, the courtroom felt it fully. The power dynamic had flipped. The fall begins behind closed doors. This court will take a 15-minute recess, Judge Roberts announced abruptly. His voice cracked slightly at the end, like a man trying to project control while the ground slipped out beneath him. Mr. Soros, I expect full documentation of these serious allegations when we reconvene. He rose and retreated from the bench faster than anyone had seen all day. Behind him, the courtroom exploded, not in noise, but in movement. Reporters whispered frantically, notes flying, DOJ agents repositioned, jurors whispered among themselves, forgetting protocol. The drama wasn't legal anymore. It was historic. George Soros sat quietly, watching it all. His team leaned in, whispering strategy. His posture remained the same as it had been all morning, calm, assured, focused. But to those who knew him, there was the faintest lift in his shoulders. It wasn't pride, it was vindication. Meanwhile, in Judge Roberts' chambers, the mood was chaos. He paced the carpet like a trapped animal, one hand twitching toward his phone, the other balling into a fist and releasing again. His judicial assistant stood awkwardly near the door. Then, a knock. Judge Roberts, the assistant said gently, there are 2 FBI agents here. They're requesting to speak with you. The color drained from Roberts' face. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask who. Send them in. Outside, the courtroom was now surrounded by security. Marshals had created a perimeter. The corridors filled with reporters making calls, filming quick updates, getting confirmation that what they were witnessing was real. The story had already gone national, and it wasn't about the defendant anymore. It was about the judge. Back inside, Soros stood by the defense table, phone pressed to his ear. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes were focused, calm, like a man watching a strategy unfold exactly as designed. The 15-minute recess stretched into 45. The federal agents who had been stationed quietly at the back of the courtroom began to reposition. Two moved closer to the chamber doors. Another stood near the judge's private entrance. The clerk returned from a hallway conversation, face pale and drawn. At 52 minutes past recess, the bailiff emerged. But instead of calling court back into session, he walked directly to the DOJ table. A quiet, urgent conversation followed. Then one of the agents pulled out a phone and stepped into the hallway. The tension was unbearable. The room was holding its breath. 5 minutes later, the rear doors of the courtroom swung open. A woman entered, flanked by two U.S. Marshals. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit and moved with undeniable authority. Around her neck, a badge identifying her as Deputy Director Lauren Vasquez, Department of Justice, Public Integrity Section. The gallery fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said clearly, "I am here to inform you that Judge John Roberts is currently being detained pending formal charges." Her voice cut through the air like a blade. Charges include judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, bribery, and racketeering under the RICO Act. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shocked murmurs, the sound of chairs shifting, reporters scrambling for their phones. Several raced out the back doors to break the story. When the noise calmed, Vasquez continued. "By order of the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, these proceedings are suspended effective immediately. This case will be reassigned to a different judge. In addition, all rulings issued by Judge Roberts over the last 5 years are now subject to federal review." She turned to the jury box. "You are all dismissed with the thanks of the court. You may be recalled when this case resumes under new judicial supervision." The jurors filed out slowly, casting glances, some of shock, others of admiration, toward Soros. Vasquez then walked to the defense table. "Mr. Soros, I understand your team has compiled additional evidence relevant to our investigation?" Soros nodded. "Yes, Director. We've identified 17 additional cases involving a clear pattern of misconduct. My office will cooperate fully." The prosecutor, James Moretti, stepped forward. "For the record," he said gravely, "the prosecution had no prior knowledge of Judge Roberts' activities. We'll begin our own internal review." Vasquez nodded. "Understood. I suggest both legal teams prepare for a full reset. This case isn't over, only restarting." Just then, movement from the side door silenced the room again. Two U.S. Marshals entered. Between them, Judge John Roberts, now in stainless steel handcuffs. The fall was televised. The silence was national. Judge John Roberts entered not through the front bench, but through the prisoner's door. Between two U.S. Marshals, the same man who had begun the day mocking George Soros now stood in the courtroom, wrists bound in polished steel, face hollowed with disbelief. The robe was gone. The arrogance was gone. Even his suit hung differently, as if it no longer fit the man inside. The cameras captured everything. The gallery, once filled with anticipation, now stared in stunned silence. Soros stood still as Roberts was escorted toward the side exit, the one used for prisoner transfers. Their eyes met, just briefly. In that fraction of a second, a lifetime's worth of realization passed between them. Roberts now understood. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a setup. This was precision, the work of someone he had underestimated, someone he tried to humiliate, someone who had dismantled his entire illusion of power, piece by piece. And George Soros? He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply watched. His expression was unreadable, his posture unchanged, his presence towering in the quiet. Only those closest to him might have noticed the small squaring of his huge shoulders. Not in triumph, but in defense of the justice system he had dedicated his life to. As Roberts disappeared through the side door, a court officer approached Soros with a clipboard. "Mr. Soros," she said softly, we need your signature, formal acknowledgement of the case suspension." Soros took the pen, signed it without ceremony. The moment the ink dried, the cameras flashed, dozens of them. The courtroom burst into life, photographers capturing the historic image, the accused judge gone, the defense lawyer standing tall, the system beginning to correct itself. It was an image that would dominate every news broadcast in America by nightfall. Outside, the courthouse steps had transformed into a media battleground. News vans with satellite dishes lined the curb, angled toward the sky like high-tech sunflowers. Microphones, boom arms, anchors rehearsing their lines. Inside, chaos held its own rhythm. DOJ representatives moved with practiced urgency. Reporters raced to exit. Even the jury, now dismissed, lingered near the doors, unable to look away from what had just happened. 20 minutes after the court had been suspended, the side door opened again. Roberts emerged once more, this time into the full blaze of the Florida sun. The marshals escorted him down the courthouse steps toward the waiting black SUV. The handcuffs around his wrist reflected the light, casting small rainbow glints across the concrete, a poetic contrast to the heavy weight of what they signified. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his head. But the questions came anyway, shouted from every direction. "Judge Roberts, do you deny the corruption charges? Were other judges involved? Was George Soros targeted because of politics? Was it personal?" Roberts said nothing. The same man who had dominated his courtroom hours earlier now couldn't find the voice to respond. The SUV doors opened. He was guided inside. The doors shut. The vehicle pulled away. And just like that, it was over. He tried to break the system. It broke him instead. The black SUV disappeared into the Miami traffic. Inside the courthouse, the tension finally broke. People exhaled. The weight of the day, the courtroom power struggle, the evidence, the reversal, settled over everyone like a dense fog of realization. But George Soros wasn't finished. Not in spirit, not in mission. He stood in the center of courtroom 4B, surrounded by what remained. Evidence boxes, reporters still typing, DOJ officials whispering in corners, and a legal team that had just pulled off what many would later call the most surgical legal dismantling of a federal judge in U.S. history. Soros took a quiet breath, then began packing up. No drama, no fanfare, just discipline. The same discipline that had carried him through decades of scrutiny, attack, and misunderstanding. Outside, the media waited. The courthouse steps had transformed into a full-blown circus. The barricades held back a sea of reporters and camera guard crews. Drones hovered overhead. Commentators were already live, using words like unprecedented, historic, and devastating. At 4:12 p.m., the courthouse doors opened. George Soros stepped into the light. A hush fell over the crowd just for a beat. Then, chaos. Flashbulbs exploded, journalists shouted, microphones reached for his face. Cameramen followed his every step. But Soros didn't rush. He descended the courthouse stairs like a man not running from a storm, but walking straight through it. One journalist pushed forward. "Mr. Soros, what do you say to those who doubted your defense strategy?" Another shouted, "Was this about revenge against Judge Roberts?" And finally, mind, will you be leading the defense when the case is reassigned? Soros stopped, turned to face the cameras. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't speak like a politician. Just clear, grounded words. This was never about revenge. It was about the integrity of the law, and proving that no one, not even a federal judge, is above it. He turned and walked toward the street, his team close behind. From the courthouse balcony, Director Vasquez watched him disappear into the crowd. Beside her, Prosecutor James Moretti stood silent, hands in his pockets. "He dismantled him," Moretti said quietly. Vasquez nodded. He didn't dismantle a judge. He dismantled a lie. Inside courtroom 4B, a court officer collected the last of the exhibits. On the wall, a portrait of the U.S. Constitution hung slightly tilted from the day's vibrations, literal and metaphorical. And somewhere in the DOJ's Washington office, 17 new case files were opened. Every one of them tied to Judge John Roberts. Every one of them connected to people who thought they'd never be caught. But they hadn't counted on George Soros, not as an investor, not as a donor, not as a defendant, but as a defender of justice.